So Hazy Pale Ales, or Session New England IPAs, if you want to call them that, have kind of become one of the driving forces behind craft beer nowadays. And many of us would love to recreate these sorts of styles at home. Some people will tell you that it's a really easy thing to brew because you can hide all sorts of flaws under the sheer rate of hopping. But those of us that have tried will know that there are actually quite a lot of pitfalls, and there are some important things that you need to be aware of. And actually, there's quite a bit of skill involved in being able to make one of these well. So to get the lowdown on how to do that, I've teamed up with Adam Makes Beer to give you, hopefully, some really useful tips and information on how to do a Hazy Pale Ale successfully, and also to share a award-winning recipe for one of his beers, which we've scaled down to homebrew level for you. And as well as providing the recipe for that, those of us in the UK will be able to buy a kit version of this beer from Brew Day brewing supplies. So if you're interested in having a go at brewing this beer that we're going to be discussing in the following video, and that I will be brewing myself in a follow-up video, then do jump onto the Brew Day website and have a look at that at the link which will be in the description. Also, before we get into the discussion with Adam, do please jump onto his YouTube channel, Adam Makes Beer. Again, link in the description, and give him a sub. So Adam is a professional brewer and his video content is really good, but geared towards kind of giving homebrewers the sort of advice and information that you'll get from an experienced commercial brewer. So well worth a look, and do go and have a watch of his videos. And like I said, give him a subscription if you can, please. So let's get on with it. It's a long bit of video here because we were chatting at some length, but hopefully there's a lot of detail in there and some useful tips that you will find helpful in your brewing of this style. Right, so first of all, welcome Adam, and thank you very much for joining me on the video. I've also got to say a big thank you for previously joining us on the Hop Edition podcast, and anyone who hasn't listened to that or watched the video back, I'll put a link in the description for that, and also obviously for all of Adam's channels and stuff as well. So do check all of those out and get yourself subbed and everything to Adam's channel and the Hop Edition. We did a much longer sort of format chat on that podcast and talked about all sorts of things. So obviously today we're kind of zooming in on Hazy Pale Ales, but if you want to get the big picture on kind of all things brewing and what Adam does, then I do recommend you go back and have a look at that podcast. So Adam, for the benefit of the people who maybe haven't listened to that podcast, you want to just give us a quick intro and sort of who you are, what you do for the viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks for having me back on. And we, like you mentioned, the stream that we did before was such a blast, and it's just fun talking. It's just fun talking beer. But anyhow, my name is Adam Mills, and I am head brewer at Cartridge Brewing. The first 10 years of my professional career, I taught high school. I've done some brewing science education on the university level as well, teaching that. And then the last 10, 11 years of my career, I've been brewing professionally. And over the last, I started recording in the beginning of 2022 and started a YouTube channel called Adam Makes Beer, and just trying to give a behind the scenes look into what it's like to be brewing and working and running a craft brewery, you know. And so, I really approach it from kind of an educational standpoint. I try to do a lot of question and answer work, a lot of tutorial, a lot of full brew day and recipe breakdowns. And it's really just been a blast. And it's led to me meeting up with some cool people and getting some great opportunities to talk beer.
Awesome. So the channel has been going great from what I've seen of all the videos that are coming out, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to do this video and get a chance to sort of pick your brains on a specific topic, and hopefully get some really useful kind of hints and tips on brewing great hazy pale ales. So we're going to kind of base this discussion around the Pathfinder recipe that you very kindly shared, and I'll again have a link to that in the description, and also there is going to be a
all grain kit for that from Brew Day. So again, follow the links in the description for that if anyone's interested over in the UK and getting hold of a kit version of the beer. So I guess the place to start with is sort of hazy pale ales. Obviously, it's a kind of development from the American pale ale style. What makes a good one for you, and how has, you know, hazy pale ale kind of developed from that maybe more old school beer that people think of when they think of stuff like Sierra Nevada?
I'm glad you
like
said
that.
Sierra Nevada. Yeah, I mean, because I think Sierra Nevada is it. You know what I mean? I think that's
the benchmark,
quintessential.
right? For,
it really is, and you know, for a period of time, people would also kind of lump in, rats. It's the brewery that makes Black Butte Porter. I can't remember, but they had a pale ale called Mirror Pond. The name of the brewery is escaping me right now. But yeah, I mean, those are like the really classic, you know, American pale ales, and they were kind of those, you know, almost golden in color. You know, like they definitely had some crystal malt in there. They definitely had some pretty firm bitterness to balance out that sweetness. And they were really starting to feature some of those early, you know, Cascade type hops, you know, and kind of getting us into that citrus peel type hop range. And those were really the benchmark. And then, you know, as hazy beers started to pop off, in my mind, those hazy IPAs are really a response of people wanting more drinkable beer. Right. And so hazy IPA is kind of the practice of how can we get as much hop flavor and aroma into a beer and have it be just bitter enough to be balanced. Right.
Yep.
So it's not like cloyingly sweet or something else like that. And it's an interesting style. In my mind, anytime you can get something a little bit lower ABV and you can have a few of, but it still scratches that hop forward itch, it's a good way to go. So,
yeah, definitely. I remember on the podcast you mentioned something about hazy beers kind of being the more approachable sort of version of like American, you know, IPAs and pale ales, and I think that definitely rings true for me. I think Sierra Nevada was probably one of the first sort of, what, you know, craft beers that I would have tried over here in the UK, and come into that from the perspective of somebody who had only ever really drunk kind of like macro, you know, lagers and maybe the odd sort of real ale at that point. The bitterness of that beer is quite in your face when you are brand new to it, right? And I think, you know, probably to an extent, some of the growth and development of the craft beer industry in recent years is perhaps, you know, down to the hazier styles being easier to on the palate sort of thing for somebody. Because Sierra Nevada was a beer for me at that point where it was like I persisted with it and I developed a taste for it eventually. But I've got to say, the first couple, it was sort of like, whoa, I'm not sure if this is for me, because it's quite full on flavor wise. Whereas I think nowadays it's probably a bit of an easier bridge for people to go from more generic kind of commercial or macro beers into the sort of softer, fruitier flavored pale ales and things like that. Perhaps. Anyway, but yeah, so Pathfinder's actually won an award. Has it? So do you want to just tell us what as a medal?
Yeah, that took a medal for, I think that took a bronze. It was in the Ohio Craft Brewers Championship. I think that's the right name for it. And it was one of the first beers we made when we opened Cartridge, and it was honestly just the owner at the time just went and took a crowler pour of it. And so, you know, an aluminum can, filled it up off the tap and seamed it up and drove it into the competition. And it ended up placing. And so, you know, and the idea behind it is it's like, okay, so, you know, how can you have that sessionable hop forward beer? and so that's what you're trying to chase, and it can present some pitfalls, because when you make smaller, lower gravity beers and they're heavily hopped, they can turn into kind of astringent hop water pretty easily. So there's some steps we try to take in order to avoid that.
Okay, brilliant. So yeah, let's get into that. I'll just do a quick kind of overview of the recipe as we've kind of scaled it down for everyone here. So we're going to be in metric. Sorry, Adam.
I got to pull this on my phone right now.
Hopefully it makes sense. So working from a 23 litre sort of batch size, and on the recipe that I've got, we're looking at 72% brew house efficiency. That brings us out at around 5.1%, which is a little bit higher than what we had on your original recipe, but otherwise that's just down to the Brewfather's idea of where the FG is going to land. Original gravity 1054, final gravity 1015, a nice light EBC color rating as you would expect, just under 9. IBUs we're just under 30 at 29, which gives us a Boogu ratio of around 0.5. Yeah, so that's the sort of the stats on this beer. As far as the malt bill, which we'll go into first, obviously we always start off with kind of like your choice of base malt on that front. And I mean, from my perspective, most of the time with beers like this, you just want something pretty simple and fairly, plain as far as flavor goes. And that's kind of the choice that you went for on this?
Yeah, and you when you kind of look at it, overall, you're not looking to pump a lot of color into these beers, and I think it's for a couple of reasons. One reason is you don't want a tremendous amount of malt flavor competing with hop character. I'm kind of a believer in if I'm going to give you something hop forward, I want it to be hop forward, and I want the malt out of the way, right? And so to really feature the hops, you will see a 7%. 7% of the grist is Carahel, kind of a lower color. Dextrin crystal type malt, so you will get a little bit of color there. But if you start getting those beers too dark, they get really mucky looking quick. You want to keep the color on them. You want to keep the color on them low, because of with all the polyphenol haze, the hop haze, the protein haze, it starts to look weird in a hurry. Like I love Dunkelweiss, the dark German wheat beer. But it's to me, it's not an appealing looking beer necessarily. Like I
think I said exactly the same thing when I did a video on that style. It's like it's the best looking glass of dishwater that I've ever made, right? It's,
I love the style. I really enjoy the style, but just visually, right? So yeah, you do want to keep that. You do want to keep that color down, and then you kind of want to build out that grist to have a fair amount of protein, beta glucan in it, and so usually I'm blending up and trying to get around 20% of wheat in a flaked product, whether that be flaked oats, flaked rye, something like that. And so that's kind of what we were doing there. So yeah, you could use something like a more flavorful base malt. And I don't think you're going to torpedo the beer or anything like that. But I do think it's a time to kind of go with a lighter hand when you're pushing, when you're pushing the malt bill on this, putting the malt bill together.
Yeah, definitely. I think, in my experience, it's always been kind of like your extra pale malts or even just sort of straight lager malts. So I think what we would be sold as kind of lager malt over here is quite often just the equivalent of a standard kind of pale or two row malt for you guys. And probably the most I guess flavorful outside of that I've gone to that's worked in my opinion has been kind of like Golden Promise is a nice one that I found. It's there's flavor there, but it's quite a sweet kind of more of a white bread rather than like biscuity, heavily malty or nutty, that you might give like a Marisotta or something like that. So So is it just a sort of standard 2-row that you've got as the base malt for what you're using in the brewery?
Yeah, and so for me, yeah, it's just a standard domestic 2-row. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So the oats and sort of wheat combination there, have you sort of spent much time kind of tweaking the balance between those in terms of the percentages, or is that more just I guess, personal preference as to what the balance is flavor wise? And
it's just a little bit of rule of thumb that I picked up from, in my mind, just an absolutely fantastic book called The New IPA by Scott Janish.
Okay.
If any of the listeners are somebody that love digging in on the reading and research side, I tell you what, that book's the best, man. It's so well researched. It's footnoted like you wouldn't believe. The end of each chapter basically has like a highlighted point summary, like the big picture takeaways.
Yeah.
Really a helpful book. And he talks about in there getting in that 20 to 25% blend of wheat and oats, wheat and something flaked. And so that's just something that I've gone with and ran with it.
So just like an overall figure to aim for, and then, do what you want within that as far as the mix. So I wanted to just quickly mention on your recipe, you had white wheat as opposed to sort of standard wheat, or I don't think a lot of people are necessarily aware of this, but you kind of have red wheat and white wheat.
Yeah, there's red and there's white. I used white just because it's what I had and what I used. I don't think you would have any issue subbing in red wheat or anything like that. You would just want it malted. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yeah. We do from the podcast. Andy is a big fan of white wheat, and he's got a local brewery that swears by going for white wheat rather than red wheat. But
I'm not good enough to know the difference. I don't even know if I've had them side by side. It would be interesting. I know when they had that book out, the Brews Association had that book on wheat come out. They waxed poetically the differences between the two. But yeah.
I'm sure it's very subtle, and when it's, I guess 7% of an overall recipe, it might be a bit trickier to pick up on any differences, right? Maybe in a Hefeweizen or something like that, you might be able to tell, perhaps. I don't know. So just coming back to the Carahel that you mentioned, so 7.2%. Sometimes with kind of NEPAs and hazy IPAs, people will sort of counsel against putting, kind of any kind of crystal malts in there. But is this maybe something to do to balance the hops a little bit with sweetness that you're maybe not getting from the higher ABV? Is that kind of your
I think you're absolutely spot on, because as we mentioned before, these beers get thin in a hurry, so it does help to have a little something to prop that body up a little bit and prop that residual sweetness up. And again, I do prefer something lower on the color scale for that, as we mentioned before. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's really about propping up a little bit some residual sweetness in order to balance with those hops, because there are a fair amount of hops, at least in my mind, and maybe I'm off, because sometimes when you look at a scaled down recipe, your brain doesn't quite think that way, but I feel like there's a decent amount of hops that go into this beer, and you do need to do something to tame that back a little bit.
Yeah, so the key there really is just make sure it's low color, sort of caramel or crystal malt. So we can get Carahel over here from Wyman. Obviously, I feel like you just had to get a Wyman malt in there for, for what you're saying. On the
you know all that I use with all the lagers I make. But yeah, absolutely.
But sort of similar malts over here that could potentially be used. I don't know if you see like Cara Gold, which is probably a kind of similar kind of color rating to that, or Cara Malt's probably edging a little bit higher on the color.
So what's the EBC on Cara Malt?
So it generally starts around 30, but it does vary a little bit with different maltsters. So it can sort of edge up a little bit towards kind of 50, 60, I think, in some cases. So some of them are probably okay. Some of them are maybe what I would think of as going a little bit too dark on the color.
Yeah, I think you're on the right track.
Cara Gold is more like 15 to 20. So that's the one that I would normally use, but I will be putting some Carahel into this one, as that's what you've got in the original recipe. So
yeah,
great. So I think that's kind of everything as far as the malt bill goes. Before we talk about the rest of the sort of brewing process there, water's obviously really important for these type of beers. And I think most people who've done any kind of reading or research into water for hazy styles or hazy pale ales is probably aware of the whole, calcium chloride to sulfate ratio and trying to lean more on the chloride side of things. What's slightly different with the way that we've scaled this recipe down here is that we've got just calcium chloride as a water addition, starting with a base of RO, because that's how I would normally brew, and that's it. So we're not putting any gypsum or Epsom salts or anything else in there to build up any of the numbers. So we're just going nice and simple, calcium chloride all the way, and we're ending up with, let me just check the numbers again, about 170 chloride and just under 100 calcium. So what's the thinking behind that?
Yeah, and so my water here is a little bit challenging to work with because it's alkaline enough that it tends to buffer a lot of things out. And so I use the Brew and Water software or spreadsheet. And so by the time I'm done with my additions, really the only thing that's left for me is chloride and sulfate, whatever I end up adding. And so those are really the two metrics. The third really being just chasing pH, making sure I have pH down to an appropriate range with the food grade acid. So I mean, one of the reasons that I try to keep this beer somewhere around 100 parts and really not too much over that as far as calcium goes is I found, at least on my system and the way I handle things, if I start nudging too high over 100 parts of calcium, that beer is going to want to drop clear, and I don't want this to. And so, and that's something, especially on the lager side, where it's a must for me. I need to have 100 parts because otherwise I'm going to struggle with clarity. And so, but I was also listening to a podcast with one of the hot boy breweries around here for making hazy beer, and they're saying, really starting to get over, I think they're maybe saying 120 parts. It really starts to get difficult. And so I'm just running with the straight calcium chloride with this, getting all my calcium from there, and then it's pushing those chloride numbers up. Now, I will say, just as a general reference, there are people that do bump that chloride number even higher. I know people that bump up to 250 and sometimes higher. If you do not want to continue to add calcium, you can use something else like a kosher salt, a non-iodized salt in the kettle that will continue to push up your chloride without continuing to thump up your calcium number.
So you're not too worried about having any sulfate at all in this, and obviously if we were adding gypsum, we'd be pushing up the calcium again as well, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so I'm just not sweating it at all. It's really interesting. I've almost all my beers right now, I'm just really leaning very, very chloride heavy. And again, this stuff all kind of depends on your water and everything like that. But I'm finding it gives me nice soft edges on a lot of beers, and that's kind of what I want to feature.
I'm all for keeping it simple on the waterfront, because people certainly overthink the water chemistry a lot. And
you can make it worse than you can better. Yeah,
exactly, 100%. And I have done beers in the past, not this particular style, but I have done beers where it's just calcium chloride as the water addition myself. And actually that was for lagers as well, because I felt like I want to keep it fairly soft water, and if I can get to where I want to be with just like one mineral being added into the water, why not do that? And that worked pretty well for me too. So it's might be a little bit unusual for some people to see it being approached like that, but it certainly has worked for me in a different recipe before. So
and you did mention that you're using RO, but just a quick note that if you're not using RO, you need to be aware of what the rest of that water profile is, because you could be stacking stuff up a little bit too aggressively. But just a heads up on that front.
Really good point. I always say to people when they start with water chemistry, don't add anything in until you know what your actual water is that you start with, because otherwise you're just like, it's a blind shoot, really, isn't it? You've got no idea what the end result is going to be. Great. So we kept water nice and simple, which is good. So let's move on. So mashing, we've got a relatively high mash temperature on here. I think I rounded it up to 69 to keep it simple. I think the proper conversion is about 68.5.
Okay.
But yeah, we're sort of on the warmer side mash temperature wise. And again, as most people will know, that's going to influence the final gravity. So yeah, do you find that the having that slightly higher final gravity is quite important as well?
Yeah, you know, and I do think it's a part of it, and it does play off a little bit what we're doing with the grist bill as well, with that lower color dextrin / caramel malt in there, and I personally, some people feel like I generally try to drive body with my grist more so than leaning on my mash, but I do think it's beneficial for this beer, because you kind of have your middle point, which I'm gonna. For me, it's like 152, 151. You make a fairly even balance of short chain and long chain sugars. But when you start ticking up, you do start making a more dextrinous wort, a less fermentable wort, and I think it's just one more little dial that you can try to turn on a recipe like this to make sure you're not going to leave yourself with a thin beer.
Yeah. So again, it's just I think, like you say, all those things sort of added together is where you end up getting that sort of nice full kind of body and mouthfeel, right? So don't want to neglect any of those and sort of ruin the good work that you've done with your grist and your water chemistry and everything else. Okay, so I guess the interesting bit now really for the rest of the recipe wise is hop scheduling. Hop choices and combinations is always a nice place to start here. So we've got some classics in this one. So we've got the Idaho 7 Mosaic and Simcoe in the Whirlpool or hop stand, and we're looking at 50 grams each of those. Now I'm working off of the sort of homebrew version of the Whirlpool, where we're looking at about 20 minutes at 80 degrees C, and that does roughly get us to the same sort of IBUs as what we were looking at on your original recipe sheet. But yeah, just coming back to the actual choice of the hops that you've got in there, first of all, is that a combination that you've played around with, or just something from like previous experience that works, or what's
well, I mean, it's a little bit of a couple things. I did not want Citra in this beer because Citra is featured relatively prominently in the standard IP, or the other hazy, the regular hazy that I had on tap. So I wanted to kind of go a different direction, but I also wanted to kind of make sure that I was staying in line with some of the research that's out now, as far as they'll use the terminology survivables, or specific hop varietals that have compounds in them that tend to stick around into the finished beer.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what they're saying when they're saying survivable. Right. Mm-hmm. So a couple of those big ones are Idaho and Mosaic. They're great Whirlpool hops for getting flavor and aroma into the finished beer. And Simcoe was one that I had around that, I mean, it's a little bit older school, I mean, because it's older than, Citra, Mosaic, and some of the Southern Hemisphere hops that are popular and stuff like that. And so, people have different opinions on Simcoe. I like it quite a bit. And so I thought it would give some nice dimension in there. And so that's really why I'm sticking with those hops and the Whirlpool, especially the Idaho and the Mosaic, because they do have an elevated capacity to transfer flavor and aroma to the finished beer. And then just some Simcoe in there for some layers, and then the Amarillo and the Mosaic and the dry hop, I usually like to come back with one of the hops that was in the Whirlpool back in the dry hop. And so I did that with Mosaic. And then we had some Amarillo on too. To me, both Amarillo and Simcoe have a little bit, and when I say throwback, I'm not talking about like Cascade Centennial or anything like that, but it is a little bit of a throwback character compared to some of the hotter hops today. And so I kind of wanted to give it little bit of range. You know what I mean? Get some tropical in there, but maybe get some of that West Coast, maybe a little bit of pine, you know, some citrus fruit and stuff like that in there. So
yeah,
that was the idea behind that.
Sort of floral orange thing to it that I think will give you a nice extra layer of flavor there. I'm really pleased that you've mentioned the Survivables research, because that was basically what I was going to say to you. This looks like it's been written with the Survivables. I did a video with one of the kind of UK reps for Yakima Chief
nice.
a little while back, using some of their cryo hops and stuff, and we talked about Survivables, and I can see their little booklet on it out the corner of my eye over here. So but I saw the recipe, I was like, Idaho 7 Mosaic and Simcoe in the Whirlpool. I think that Adam's been doing some research here on Survivables.
Try to, right?
That's cool. But yeah, I mean, Robbie was the guy from Yakima Chief, so if Robbie's watching this, thanks again for doing that video. But he was singing the praises of Idaho 7 massively, because it's right up the top of that chart.
Yeah, man. And I think it's really catching on too. I think that's one that is that's going to be, I think it's an increasing demand, because it is such a unique character. To me, in the Whirlpool, you get a nice, almost kind of pineapple note out of it, and it's just a really exceptional hop with that usage.
Yeah, I've noticed a lot recently. A lot of breweries over here in the UK, if it's a 3 or 4 hop beer, Idaho 7 always seems to be in there in the mix more often than not now. And I think that people cottoning on to this kind of like Whirlpool workhorse role that it can kind of fill in there. So. And Mosaic and Simcoe, I'm a big fan of Simcoe as well. I have done a hazy beer that was kind of all Mosaic and Simcoe before, and I found that it gave me a really sort of, if I remember rightly, quite a potent sort of like passion fruit flavor came out of that one for me. So I think you can get some interesting, depending on how you blend them and stuff, combinations of flavors out of those two. So yeah, I wasn't sure about mixing them at first, because I think Mosaic is that parented by Simcoe? I might be wrong there, but
it could be.
But I thought they might be a little bit samey, but actually they did kind of play off each other and give you something different. So it looks like a great hop schedule. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that works out at this end. As far as just coming back to the sort of Whirlpool, so I mentioned kind of 20 minutes, 80 degrees C here it seems to be a fairly common kind of approach to it on the homebrew scale. What's the difference there as far as sort of the reality of what happens in a commercial scale brew house in terms of like time, temperature, and everything else? And do you think the 20 minutes at 80 degrees is a decent sort of equivalent at homebrew level, or
I think that's gonna get you in a good spot for it, and this is the most challenging thing about scaling a recipe like this, because if I was giving you a recipe where it was you needed 25 IBU at 60, you needed 10 IBU at 20 minutes or something like that, we can run those numbers very easily, right? But when you're loading hops into the Whirlpool, it's a whole different animal, and like you mentioned, really ultimately it's all about contact time and temperature, really, right? And on the larger scale, my kettle does not drop temperature the way a 5-gallon or 8-gallon, 10-gallon kettle does, right? It's just a thermal mass game. And the flip side is my hops are going to be in contact with that hot wort for longer than they will be for you too, just because it's going to take me so much longer to get my beer cold and into the fermenter. So what I do try to do is with making bigger batches, I've been trimming back my whirlpooling times and everything like that, and trimming back the amount of time I let the kettle rest before I start running off, just so we're not going overboard there. But no, you're absolutely correct.
Okay, great. So that's reassuring, because that's what I've been doing most of the time. Like I said, I think that's a pretty standard approach. I think most people are looking at kind of 20 to 30 minutes. And I think you're either getting diminishing returns as far as the hop flavor, and potentially extracting more bitterness than what you want after that kind of period anyway. So
well, and
also,
the nice thing for me is and the more we talk beer, I'm excited that I'm excited that you have the experience you have on your side, because you know when this stuff makes sense at your scale, right? And so you're able, you know, it's cool. I'm glad, because I think we've been able to put something together that's going to get somebody a really nice beer, you know.
Yeah, I hope so. Hopefully me too.
Where's your
So just to quickly mention, so theoretical IBUs on this are working out about 30. So as I've said before, Boogu ratio of about 0.5. Is that kind of you know, safe spot for you as far as hazy pales like this? What would be the upper limit? And you know,
yeah, I think so. And you know, it's all dependent on how the beer's built. You know, like if you take a leaner approach, you know, if you're going to make a drier beer, you're going to want to make sure that you're trying to curtail some of that bitterness a little bit with it as well. So it's all just kind of, you move one dial and the other ones move with it. You know what I mean? As far as trying to maintain that balance. Yeah.
So fermentation wise, you're using the Imperial, that was the word I was looking for. So Imperial yeast A38 juice, and that is, as far as I know, a sort of London Ale free derived.
Yeah, it's London 3. Yeah. So anybody, anything that you have there that would be a London 3 type beer would be great. A yeast.
So we've got Imperial yeast over here, luckily, because they're great. I really like Imperial yeast as far as the kind of liquid yeast suppliers go. We are also lucky to have it in dried format from a couple of companies now as well. So Brew Day, who are doing the kit for this, actually have a yeast called Saturated, which is a dried version of LA3. And obviously you will get some variation between the different manufacturers and so on. But
who's the manufacturer of that dry?
They're called WHC Yeast. I think they're an Irish yeast company.
Interesting. Okay.
So yeah, I don't know if they're sort of over in the States at all. I've got a feeling probably not at this point. But yeah, that's, as far as I know, is definitely a London Ale sort of derived dry yeast, which is really handy, because it's, you know, so many people wanting to use that nowadays. And we've had commercial breweries on who've said that they are using that as an alternative to having to go down the liquid yeast route. You know, obviously. Do
you find that it holds haze well? Does it give a consistent haze? So the compelling thing about that is because I was going to say, if you are using a liquid London 3 derivative, even though it's not a really big beer, I'm always pro getting a little starter going and making sure, because well, depending on how old the package is and everything like that, but you know, making sure that they're happy and healthy and moving. I'm a huge proponent of that. But the interesting thing is a lot of times I get caught up in needing to repitch yeast just because of cost reasons. But it does open up a range of opportunities for you, especially with a dry alternative. You could run this recipe as is, but you could also run this recipe as a fermentation hop as well. And not like we'll get into shortly, but you could dry hop this during an active portion of fermentation as well, especially if you're not worried about harvesting the yeast, because in my mind it kind of makes that slurry less desirable.
Yeah, so we were talking before, that's kind of part of your process, because you are needing to harvest the yeast that you'll generally ferment out fully, diac rest, and drop the yeast out before you then go on to dry hop. But like you say, homebrew scale, we could maybe play around with that schedule a little bit and look at some active fermentation dry hopping perhaps with it as well.
Sure. Yeah.
So what temperature are you using the juice yeast at when you're fermenting?
I like to go I like to go a little bit higher in that range, so I'm going to try to be prepared and say 21C, which is 70. I had my calculator out, man. I'm getting better. But yeah, like 21C, which might be a little bit on the higher side, but then I would even let it walk up to 72, or not 72. but 22
Yep.
over the course of ferment, especially toward the tail end. These strains do tend to really, they're a very yeast dense krausen. Right.
Mhm.
So they're going to have a lot of there. It's going to be, because sometimes krausen is, protein and different things like this. But those London 3 strains, at least in my experience, you can push a lot of slurry out of your fermenter with a blow off on it. And with going with a little bit warmer like this, because sometimes I would typically treat this yeast a little bit cooler. But I think with a hot forward beer like this, it is nice to be a little bit on the higher end of that scale. At least in my mind, that's a little bit higher end of the scale.
Well, it's an expressive estery yeast, right? So you want to kind of get that element out of it, and a little bit extra temperature wise is going to help on that front. 21 degrees tends to be the temperature that I go for with that saturated yeast that we mentioned, and it works well. So it's not it's not overpowering, but it definitely just brings a little bit extra fruity esters into the mix, which is good. So yeah, that sounds pretty sensible to me. Any other sort of yeast options that, if people are struggling to get hold of that you would potentially suggest?
Well, I mean, there's a whole range of things. I'm just starting to. I have my first 2 beers in the fermenter with some of the thiolized strains, and so like from Omega, I've been using this my second turn on Heliogazer. From Omega. I have also used Imperial over here, has some hybrid strains that they're coming out with. One is Capri, and I'm not sure if it's available over there or not, but I believe it is.
That is definitely available over here. That's just come out. So yeah, we can get Capri. In fact, I've got a packet of that somewhere.
I've done some work with Capri as well, which is a really nice yeast as well. And yeah, so I mean, kind of go anywhere within, I don't know, somewhat within that in those British ranges, if you want. Like for me, I found when I was at Craft Brewers Conference last year, I drank a lot of hazy beers. There's have tons of beers available, so you get samples. And London 3 is very specific, and sometimes you might burn out on that profile. And so, play with some of the other, British type ester forward yeasts if you're a little burnt out on London 3, or try some of the other either hybrid or thiolized stuff. Yeah,
I must admit I'm pretty familiar with it because one of my favorite UK breweries uses it, the house yeast. So I've drunk a lot of beers with London Ale 3 in, but loads of craft breweries use it over here. Another dry yeast that could be an option would be Verdant yeast, which is a sort of child of London Ale 3 anyway, from Verdant in the UK. So that could be an option. But yeah, I mean, I tend to stick to the sort of LA 3 style yeast for these kind of beers myself anyway.
Sure.
Right. So last few bits here on kind of conditioning and packaging. We sort of touched on the dry hopping, approach briefly there. But again, just to come back to that, talking about kind of exposure time for the dry hops and temperature wise, what's your processes there?
Yeah, what's working for me is so I'm dealing with stainless steel tanks that I can pressurize and drop temperature on and control that closely. And I can also rouse them with CO2 and things like that. So what I will do is I will drop my fermenter down to 58F or 14C. And at that temp, I can usually get that yeast to flock out and get down to the bottom of the fermenter. And then I'm getting that yeast off the beer or out of the beer. And then I'm dry hopping from there. And increasingly what I've done is I really kind of stick to close to 24 hours on those dry hops. And I do like to rouse it aggressively with CO2. If you're dealing with smaller fermenters, you can swirl them, different things like that. But all the way through, and this is really one of the big keys, and especially with hoppy beer, you want to do anything you can do to keep oxygen out of these beers. So I know some people are doing closed transfers. If you're bottling, I would go out of your way to make sure that bottling bucket that you use is take like a little shrink wrap and put it over the top of your sanitized bucket and get a CO2 line in there and purge it, and then back in there. Just do whatever you can, right? And but yeah, try to diminish O2 as far as the packaging goes. But back to the dry hop, I try to stay around 24 hours contact time as long as I can rouse. If you don't have a way to rouse your fermenter, I definitely don't think you want that beer on those hops for more than 3 days, and then getting them into another vessel. And then as far as conditioning goes, with beers like this that are heavily Whirlpool hopped and I think relatively heavily dry hopped, they can take a little time to round out. It's kind of a balancing act between making sure you're drinking them fresh and potentially dealing with a little bit of hop burn. So yeah, but again, it's personal preference with that too. Some people don't mind hop burn at all, and they just feel like
it's interesting. It seems to have become a flavor that people are chasing to an extent these days, and I'm not fully on board with it myself.
I agree.
The obsession with getting cans like fresh off the line from breweries is a bit. It's gone too far as I'm concerned. I mean, there's beers from like breweries that I love that I've had, and they've literally been released that week, and I've tried one, and it's been less than optimum, I would say, flavor wise, and I'll come back to it 2, 3, even 4+ weeks later. Yes. And it's a massively improved beer, in my opinion. And I think that's kind of something that, perhaps people are forgetting a little bit, that, you want them fresh, but they need time to just relax a little bit and balance out and drop that.
And even some things that are a little counterintuitive. But like in the Scott Janish book, they were saying that they'll use Biofine, the clarifier, in order to help to drop hop burn. They'll say those beers will hit their stride sooner. Now, obviously, you don't want to be using enough to make the thing drop bright or whatever. But yeah. So even sometimes a little brush up on the conditioning side, whether it be some sort of fining agent without going too far, but are really just giving it a little bit of time too. That's really the active factor there.
That kind of makes sense, because a lot of that hop burn has got to be just fine, very fine hop particulate that's in the beer. Which, if you're drinking it, you are tasting raw hop, and if you can pull that out, then that's obviously going to be a benefit. Have you ever played around with any kind of like oxygen scavenging additives for these sorts of beers, or is that not really something that you've needed?
I haven't. And so are folks using it on? I don't have any experience with it. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, I've done it a couple of times. I think my process that I've got and the equipment that I've got enables me to keep everything fairly like oxygen free and sealed, and do closed.
What are some of those agents that people are using for that?
So like Camden tablets, a small amount of Camden tablet, which is sodium metabisulfate or potassium metabisulfate. I think there's 2 versions which are either or, but those will scavenge oxygen. You only need a very small amount. Apparently you can it can have a flavor impact if you overdose on it, and it's a real tiny amount that you need. Or ascorbic acid, which is vitamin C essentially, can also be used apparently. So people are doing that on the homebrew scale, because again, like there'll be a lot of situations where it's difficult to maintain closed system or transfers or whatever. People, so they'll kind of try and take it out at the back end by using
absolutely
a bit of that. So
absolutely, that's interesting.
Useful. And I guess if you're going for a belt and braces approach, you can do that and the closed transfers and everything else, and hopefully keep it really down to a minimum as much as possible. So I think it's a good sort of thing to kind of pick up right at the end there, that you can do everything right on the brew day, and you can ruin that beer very, very quickly when it comes to kind of packaging and getting out. So, something which I think most home brewers have learned to their cost in recent times, with more of these styles being being made,
Sure.
unfortunately. So I think just one other thing that we've got on there, that did we talk about sort of carb levels for the beer in terms of like serving it and what works for you on that front?
So, and there's a couple different ways you can go with it. I think if you go with kind of a standard, in my mind, what is a standard carb rate of like 2.4, 2.5? That's a pretty standard craft beer carb rate over here. I personally, for like when I do lagers, I like to push it up to 2.7 or 2.8. But it just, I don't know, makes them a little bit brighter to me. So the kind of balancing point is you don't want to make the beer so gassy, because really you're adding carbonic acid, right? And so it does have a balancing effect. And so you can make an argument for going maybe 2.3, 2.4 for a beer like this. So it's not too gassy. You're not leaning it out too much with the carbonation. But the flip side is when you go a little closer to 2.7, 2.8, maybe it pushes those aromatics out of the glass a little bit more aggressively. And so I would say those are two different ways to approach it. Maybe shoot 2.4, 2.5, but if you want to take a different approach, and that maybe you wouldn't mind the beer being a little snappier, maybe do push it up a little bit, maybe a little bit of personal preference.
Yeah. As we're talking about carbonation levels, we might as well mention sort of serving temperatures as well. So do you just have everything at a standard serving temperature in the bar, or do you have the opportunity to like vary that at all? If you could change it, what would you have the hazy at? If you would you have it?
I think those beers are better off. They're better off warmer than what we would typically be serving at. So I'm typically serving at a little over 3 degrees. That's a pretty typical beer cooler here. But I think those beers are awfully nice and around like 6 to 7 degrees Celsius, kind of mid to low 40s Fahrenheit. I think you get those beers too cold and it can push back. It can kind of push down those hot flavors and aromas a little bit.
100%. Right. I think we've pretty much covered everything that we wanted to talk about. So anything that you can think of that we've missed out?
No, man. I'm just super excited, and honestly, like I was looking forward to this beforehand, but after talking it out and putting our brains together on this, I'm even more excited about it now. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it, man. This is gonna be great.
I'm very excited about actually brewing this beer, which I'm hopefully going to try and get scheduled in at some point this weekend if I can. I want to get that done as soon as possible. But again, thanks so much for sharing your knowledge and the recipe, and helping me to put that out there for the guys watching the channel. And again, if you haven't already done so, please go and check out Adam's channel, Adam Makes Beer. We'll put a link in on the description of this video. It looks like from the amount of time we've been talking that I will definitely be splitting this one up into at least 2 parts. So there will be the brew day footage and the tasting and everything of the finished beer to follow. But I hope that those of you watching this have got some useful information out of it. And if you've got anything that you think can add to the discussion, or some of your own hints and tips that you can add into this, please chuck them into the comments, and maybe we can do a follow-up and things like that at some point as well. But this has been great, and I would if this goes well, hopefully we can maybe look at doing some other recipes at some point in the future.
I'd love to.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much, Adam. And get over to Adam's channel and drop him a sub, guys. So cheers.
I'm the dude. So that's what you call me, that or his dudeness, or duder, or El Duderino, if you're not into the whole brevity thing.